The end of the year is chaotic for film lovers. Best of the year lists litter our timelines while various awards organizations release their nominees and appoint their winners. There are endless details to track, and the minutia of who is ahead of who and what is better than what can cloud our thinking about what we're really seeing. Given the nature of my channel, I thought I would take a step back and think about what the year looked like for women in film generally. I loved so many films this year. In fact, I really enjoyed most of the Best Picture nominees, so why is it that I feel so underwhelmed? Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Be sure to stay tuned to the end of the video to learn more about what they have to offer. In the early 1990s, Denise Di set out to produce a new version of Little Women. She discovered that an adaptation would be more difficult to greenlight than she'd expected. Studios considered female-driven films like needle-in-the-eye movies, meaning they assumed men would say something like, "I'd rather have a needle in the eye than go see that movie." And why bother making a film that just isn't going to put butts in seats? We'll get to Little Women specifically in a minute, but I wanted to mention this because it contrasts with a measurable cultural change that we're experiencing today. Where major studios were once terrified of producing female-driven films, we now see the biggest franchises in the world actively seeking female perspectives. Star Wars, Frozen, Captain Marvel, Wonder Woman. Granted, most of these are from the same company, which is a rant for another day, but it's clear that in 2019, women aren't the commercial problem that they were in the latter half of the 20th century. Women, or rather skinny white women, are front and center and raking in hundreds of millions of dollars. Unsurprisingly, the industry has miles to go to reach equality for women of color. In 2019, 70% of major female characters were white, 18% were black, 6% were Latina, and 5% were Asian. But beyond the blockbuster, the picture becomes a bit bleak. I mean, seeing a female protagonist when scrolling through a list of Best Picture winners is kind of like finding an M&M in a trail mix that's mostly raisins, you know? Like, you're a little surprised you found one, but you're still really excited. Since the year 2000, I think there have been 4? Are we counting Crash? Do we acknowledge Crash? Kyle Buchanan even pointed out in the New York Times that a movie with 2 or more women in the lead hasn't won Best Picture since Chicago in 2003. And looking at the crop of films this year, it seems like we're looking at more of the same. The Hollywood Reporter's predictions for Best Actress look a bit famished compared to Best Actor. Variety even admitted as much on their YouTube channel.
So we have 2 surefire nominees in a category of 5. A few months ago, this was looking like maybe a weak category.
So while women have, for the most part, overcome their commercial problem, women do seem to have a prestige problem. Why do women's stories fall short of recognition time and time again? What is considered good or important cinema? Thankfully, the Academy isn't the only body attempting to answer that question, and their decisions are rarely considered sacrosanct. But the fact remains that for most of cinematic history, a largely homogenous group has created and selected the films to canonize the best of the best. So it's understandable that certain types of films repeatedly find their way to the top of the podium. Historical dramas that are obviously important but also so sad that you never watch them again. Historical dramas that are ostensibly heartwarming but are actually just cringy. Men at war, men in show business, men in organized crime. Men have taken center stage since the decline of the studio system in the 1960s, and intentionally or not, have shaped the definition of prestige in their image, both its visual vocabulary and its subject matter. Despite recent efforts to diversify, the Academy's 9,000 members remain 68% male and 84% white, so perhaps it's not exactly shocking that the films most seriously vying for Best Picture this year, with the significant exception of Parasite, spend a lot of time employing motifs repeatedly deemed important by the Academy over the years. Men and their friends and their guns, men without friends but with guns, and the Best Actress category, devoid of these tropes, falls into familiar patterns as well, elevating generally average biographical stories of famous women, typically in show business, none of which will be considered Best Picture material, with one exception. Little Women is perhaps the perfect film to juxtapose with this roster of male protagonists. At the end of the film, Jo mentions that she's working on a story, but she believes no one will find it interesting because no one cares about domestic life. The same could be said of not just Little Women in this field of contenders, but also of women's stories more broadly. Domesticity, perhaps the most common theme among Best Actress nominees, has come to mean lower stakes. If it doesn't have global implications, if no blood is shed, why should it be taken seriously? Is publishing a novel really that dramatic? We see this sentiment at play this season. A narrative has developed that Little Women has a Little Men problem. Journalists and film Twitter pundits alike have theorized that, well, men just don't or even can't like Little Women. On the one hand, this can read as condescending and prescriptive. Most, if not all, men I've talked to have really enjoyed it, whereas I've read several bad reviews written by women. On the other hand, gender divisions of audiences do exist. Amy Pascal, the producer of Little Women, experienced this early in the season. She told Vanity Fair, "I don't think that men came to the screenings in droves, let me put it that way." Similarly, Judy's opening demographics were almost exactly what you'd expect. Instead, awards continue flowing to the familiar, to stories with seemingly higher stakes and the body count to prove it. Interestingly, a significant portion couch those stories in nostalgic settings. Todd Phillips borrows Scorsese's aesthetic, placing Joker in the early 1980s. Scorsese himself marks his return to the gangster film with his usual cast of characters. Tarantino remembers a Hollywood when Roman Polanski was just a good director. I admittedly haven't seen Ford vs. Ferrari, but it seems like the kind of movie the man in the guys just being dudes vine would want to see.
What's better than this? Guys being dudes.
Again, set in the 1960s. 1917, though no one alive today could reminisce on its events, except for maybe Olivia de Havilland, just feels like an Oscar film. After all, the very first Best Picture Oscar in 1929 went to Wings, a World War I romance that dazzled with its aerial stunts and groundbreaking cinematography. 15 war films have won Best Picture since. Whether or not the criticisms are valid, it is interesting that two separate debates occurred accusing two Best Picture contenders of saddling famous, talented women with borderline mute roles. The lack of complicated female characters in many of the Best Picture contenders is explainable and excusable in the name of historical accuracy, but those are the venues that these filmmakers have chosen to explore aging, loneliness, work, fatherhood, and friendship. It's difficult to imagine a film set in 2019 so capable of sidelining women. In fact, most of this season's more compelling female characters live in modern times. Lupita Nyong'o's powerful matriarch and her subterranean counterpart, Florence Pugh's grief-stricken girlfriend in search of a community, Ana de Armas's nurse thrown into a familial mystery, Alfre Woodard's warden haunted by her life's work. While these performances were widely admired, they aren't the usual Oscar fare. They play in the margins, embracing and mixing genre, permitting similar violence to male roles, and even rejecting happy endings. So while some studios are taking a chance, they just don't have the money, the award strategy, or the look of a Best Picture story. And money may just be the biggest factor of all. Money is a sign of faith. Studios authorize big budgets because they assume that film will yield a significant enough return to justify the cost. As we've established, studios are greenlighting female-led films that cost over $100 million to make. They just aren't doing it when women aren't in fucking space. Take a look at this graph, which shows the budgets of most major awards contenders in 2019. In red are films with female protagonists, purple have co-leads, and blue are male protagonists. You may have noticed a gendered skew. Now you may be thinking, look, just because a movie is expensive doesn't mean that it's necessarily better. Moonlight, for example, had a very small budget, definitely smaller than La La Land's. I concede the point. However, when thinking about this year in particular, I have to wonder, would any of these films be the same without their budgets? Would we care about 1917 if it weren't one continuous shot? Would The Irishman seem as sweeping a statement about time without expensive CGI to de-age its actors? Maybe. But just as we can only speculate about what The Irishman or 1917 would look like with a smaller budget, we can only imagine what Little Women or The Farewell would look like if their budgets were doubled. The fact is, films that star women do not have the financial freedom, discounting blockbusters of course, to make the flashy creative decisions the Academy tends to like. Films directed by women have a similar hurdle to overcome. In 2019, established male auteurs helmed many of these higher budget films. There's Tarantino, Scorsese, Mendes, Brad Pitt produced Ad Astra, James Mangold, the director of Ford vs. Ferrari, has previously directed films that cost over $100 million. For many of these men, there's a level of faith, an understanding built on decades of awards recognition and box office receipts that inspires the confidence needed to believe the investment is worth it. But that level of faith is not something many female directors have had the privilege of earning. Qualitatively excellent, well-respected, experienced female directors still make news more often for awards they don't win than for the ones they do. Women directed a historic high of films this year, which is incredible, but it's also just 15% of the films released in 2019. Only 9 have ever directed a film that cost $100 million, and almost all of those were superhero or Disney movies. Imagine if there were even a handful of women consistently given resources like that to tell the stories they wanted to tell. In my opinion, 2019 was a great year in film. I really enjoyed a lot of the movies vying for Best Picture this year. The Irishman and Marriage Story easily made my top 10, and I wish that films like Pain and Glory, Uncut Gems, and Transit could get even more attention than they're getting. It's such a wonderfully crowded year for Best Picture and Best Actor, so I don't want my advocacy confused with disdain. I'm not saying that films by men are bad, or conversely that films by women are inherently good. I'm not saying that any male filmmakers specifically are bad, or that anyone deserves or does not deserve an Oscar nomination simply because of their gender. I am saying that we have a little farther to go if we truly aspire for equality when it comes to representation in front of and behind the camera. As the Academy continues to diversify its membership, studios must actively invest in giving women, especially women of color, ample resources to make creative decisions they actually want to make. Maybe then we'll break open the definition of prestige and make the films we cherish look a little more like the people who cherish them. Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Listen, it's 2020, we're all making resolutions of new things we can try or creative endeavors we want to dive a little deeper into, and Skillshare is a great way to do that in the new year. It's an online learning community that offers classes designed for real life. I personally am such an amateur when it comes to Photoshop, so something like Temi Coker's digital poster design class is perfect to help me elevate the design of my channel. And hey, his work also combines the aesthetics of animals and humans, so it also could possibly have elevated the production of design of cats. Skillshare is incredibly affordable, especially when it comes to pricey in-person classes and workshops. An annual subscription is less than $10 a month, so join today. Click the link in the description below to get 2 free months of premium membership and explore your creativity. Now back to the patrons.